So welcome to our free LSAT prep hour for October 14th. My name is Scott Miller. I'm based in Durham, North Carolina. I work as an LSAT instructor with Manhattan Prep. I do a lot of courses and private tutoring online, teach a lot of online courses, and I get to do these Zoom free prep hour webinars every once in a while too, which are fun. Just a little commercial here to start with. Not really a commercial, it's more of a public service announcement. We have a lot, so we do these free prep hours twice a month, and we have a lot of other free options, free resources that you can find on our website. And if you are here attending live tonight in the free prep hour session, I'm going to put a couple links in the chat window at the end of the webinar for some of these free resources on our website. If you are watching the YouTube recording, then you should be able to look in the information about the video, about the recording, and find these links as well. So you can attend any of our live online or in-person LSAT classes. You can attend session 1 of a class for free to see what our classes are all about. And then we also have our LSAT Interact classes. You can try those. You can try a couple sessions of those for free. But again, there's a bunch of good stuff on our website, so I recommend you check that out. I'll give you an opportunity to do that after the session. I'll share those links again. And so here's what we're covering tonight. Here's what we're going to get into tonight. We're going to talk about strengthen and weaken, logical reasoning, strengthen and weaken questions. And the questions that we look at tonight will be from Prep Test 68. So if you happen to have that handy nearby, you can look at these on paper. Or if you do have that prep test and you want to go back and review later on, you can do that. That's where the questions are coming from. Before we do that, though, before we get into strengthen and weaken questions and logical reasoning, I'm going to take a little bit of a big picture step because we had some. So for people who are attending the free prep hour here live tonight, you may have gotten an email with a link to a survey where you can ask some questions. And so we give people an opportunity to ask questions before the session. And I always try to take a look at those. And we had a really good question in the survey tonight about practice tests. How many practice tests should I do and how do I review them? And the person who asked the question basically, let me ask a question for those who are here live with us tonight. In the chat window, give me just a general idea of what your experience is with the LSAT. And I know, I communicated with some people by email previously, so this is just to kind of refresh that, rephrase that, repeat that again. How many, so have you taken the LSAT before? If you've taken the LSAT before, let me know that. If you've been prepping on your own, let me know that. If you've been taking an LSAT course, just go ahead and, like, in a sentence or two, let me know what your experience is with the LSAT. It's always, we tend to have a range of experience levels in these sessions, and it's always good to get an idea of what people's experience levels are. Have you taken any practice tests yet? Have you taken an actual LSAT yet? Have you done a course? Have you done prep on your own? Just in the chat window, give me a quick description of your experience with the LSAT. And then another question is, okay, good to see that. Again, if you need to find that, the chat window, the chat button, just hover your mouse over the bottom of the screen. You'll see that chat button pop up. I also have another question. How many practice tests do you think is an ideal number to take? What do you think is the ideal number of practice tests for someone to take to be prepared for the test? Put a number in the chat window. What do you think is an ideal number? If you're not sure, take a guess. So an ideal number is 5, okay. 15, okay. So it's interesting. You guys are about the bottom and top of the range that we've found to be useful. So based on some internal research that we did, we found that an ideal number of practice tests to take is approximately 6 to 14. there's nothing magic about these numbers, but what we find is two common mistakes that people make. One is that people will do too few because, the LSAT is a very strenuously timed test, very rigidly timed test, right? You have 35 minutes to answer a whole bunch of questions. And if you don't do enough practice tests, if you don't get enough practice under actual time conditions, then on test day, you're going to have a hard time. Even if you've spent, a lot of time preparing and studying, you've done a bunch of individual questions. If you don't do enough full-time practice tests under realistic conditions, you don't really end up being able to execute what you know and your knowledge and your understanding on test day. So you do need to get, that's why, and people who are doing fewer than 6 tests, that may be the issue, is they're just not getting enough actual practice under actual conditions. Now, the other end of the scale, the other mistake that people make is they just do as many practice tests as possible, right? Like I've talked to people who've done 10, 20, 30, 40, I don't know about 40, but I definitely have talked to people who've done 30 or more practice tests and, are going out and trying to do every single practice test available. What do you think is the problem with that? Well, I mean, it sounds like a good idea, right? Do as many as possible. What do you think would be the problem with doing too many practice tests? Why would that be an issue? Any ideas? Not learning from your mistakes. Yeah, that's a big issue. You're just talking to people who've done a lot of practice tests. Very often, they're not taking time to really thoroughly review the work that they do. They're just doing one practice test after another, after another, after another. And so you're not really learning anything. You're just repeating. They say practice makes perfect. Actually, practice makes permanent. So like whatever you're doing, if you just keep doing it over and over again, you're just going to keep doing it the same way. Also, people get burned out, right, from just doing the same thing over and over and over again. So like if you've done 20 or 30 practice tests, that's okay. Like you can reset, but what you're probably going to want to do is take a break from doing practice tests for a while. Go do other stuff, do other types of LSAT prep for a few weeks, give yourself a break from the practice tests, and then go back and do them at, maybe a little bit more conservative rate. Not trying to do them like every day or, even every other day. So, and the other thing to realize is the higher score that you want to achieve, and especially the more you want to increase your score by, the more practice tests you need. So like if you take a diagnostic test, let's say, you don't know anything at all about the LSAT, really good thing to do is go take a practice test. So you take a practice test and maybe you get a 160 on your first practice test. Let's say you get a 155. Let's say you get a 155 and your goal score is like a 160. That's the score that will get you into the law school that you want to attend. So a 5-point increase is, that's a reasonably modest increase. So maybe a little bit on the lower end of that 6 to 14 scale. If you're doing 6 to 8 practice tests, that might be enough. If you score like a 150 on your first practice test and you want to get a 170 on the real thing, you're looking at doing more along the lines of the higher end of the range, the 14 practice tests with a lot of study and review in between. It's possible to raise your score by 20 points. I'm not saying it's impossible. I've seen people do it, but it generally requires several months of pretty serious prep, maybe 6 months even or more. And it's going to require you to do a fair number of practice tests. All right, so the other big question people have is, how do you review practice tests? And I'm just going to cut to the chase here. I'm going to tell you the most common way that people review their work, review their practice tests. It's basically pretty simple. People look at the questions they get wrong, look up the correct answer, and try to understand why they got it wrong. And this is, super common. I talk to people all the time who say this is the way that they review their work. And there's a much more effective way to review your work. And it's something that we recommend for all of our students who take our courses, all the private tutoring students that I work with. This is, we have a more effective review process that is going to help you increase your score more effectively than just looking up the ones you got wrong, and trying to understand why you got them wrong. A lot of people do this. This is common, but there's a better way to do it. So I'm going to show you that. And again, before we get into anything else, we are going to talk about some actual LR questions. We're going to talk about strengthen and weaken. But before we do, this is so important, and especially since somebody specifically asked a question about it. That's one reason, but also because this is so important and so valuable. If you're doing this already, and what we're about to describe is called a blind review. Maybe some people are familiar with that already. But if you're not familiar with this, or you're not already doing this, this is one of the most valuable and important things that you can do to increase your score. And I want to make sure everybody's familiar with this process and is actually using it. Not just, I've heard about this before. That's great if you've heard about it before, but I want to make sure people actually use this. So I'm going to take just a minute or two to go over this. So, and this is a page from a practice test, right? I intentionally put these big gray boxes over the questions because I want you focusing on this big picture idea of how to review and not looking at these questions and getting distracted by them and trying to figure out what the correct answer is, right? So here's the way you review. While you're working under time conditions. So let's say this is a practice test or a section from a test that you're doing, you're working on these questions. You want to mark questions for review while you're working. So let's say you found question 3 kind of challenging. Maybe you got an answer, but you really weren't sure of your answer. And maybe question 6 took a lot longer than you expected. So you're circling those. You can circle them, you can put a star by the question, whatever you want to do. Mark those questions that are difficult, that are time consuming, that where you're just not sure of your answer. Like, maybe some of you run into that situation where you get down to 2 answers or 2 answers that look really good and you pick one of them, but you're not really sure which one of the 2 is correct, or it takes you a long time to figure out which one of the 2 are correct. These are the questions that you want to be marking while you're working under time conditions. So that's step 1. Step 2 of our review process is before you check answers. So you finish the test or you finish the section, and before you check answers, you're going to review these questions. You don't even know what the correct answer is. You just know these questions were really difficult. So you go back and review them and break the questions down. Take your time. When I say review, this should be untimed. This should be leisurely. You should have a nice cool drink. You should have your feet up, some soft music on. Really take your time. Like if it takes you 10 or 15 minutes to analyze one of these questions, that's totally fine. Now, you may circle a lot of questions. Like on a full practice test, you may circle a whole bunch of questions. You may realize, like, I have other things to do in my life. I have a job, I have school, whatever. I don't have time to review all of these and take 15 minutes on every one. That's okay. Mark as many as you want and then be selective if you need to about which ones you review. But it's better to review a smaller number and take your time than it is to rush through the review process or not do the review this way. So we're marking questions for review. We're reviewing them before we even know what the answer is. And then the next step after that, step 3, is to go ahead and check answers and try to mark which ones you got wrong, but don't write down what the correct answer is. So maybe I got question 6 wrong and maybe I got question 5 wrong. So I mark those as incorrect. Now I'm going to go back and do another review pass. I'm going to review those questions that I answered incorrectly. Now I don't have to review question 6 down here again because I've already reviewed it. So I'm basically just reviewing the ones that I got wrong that I have not reviewed yet. I don't know what the answer is. And seriously, if you go and check answers and you have to wait a day or wait a couple hours to try to forget what the answers are, and then go back and review these ones that you got wrong. Whatever you got to do to try to block the correct answers out, really pick them apart, try to figure out for yourself what the correct answer is. And then the last thing you do, the very last thing you do, is go back and note what the correct answers are for the ones that you got wrong. So, and hopefully by this time, you already know what the correct answer is. By reviewing, you have a thorough understanding of the question, you know what the answers are. If you're still confused, you can do things like go on our LSAT forums. We have explanations for a lot of questions. But the idea is, review is a multi-step process, and the bulk of the review is done before you ever know what the correct answer is, trying to find your own mistakes. So just quickly in the chat window, how many people, and just be honest, it's okay if the answer is no, how many people are already doing this process, this review process, exactly the way I described here? Give me a yes or a no if you're doing it exactly the way I described. Okay, I'm seeing some no's coming in. A lot of people don't. What do you think about it? Does it sound useful? Let me know in the chat window if it sounds like something that you want to try the next time you do some timed work. Okay. I do suggest you try it. I mean, it's really, this can make all the difference between somebody who's really flatlining, doing a bunch of practice tests, but really not seeing any increase in their score versus someone who actually sees their score increase and is able to push their score up and get the kind of improvement they want. Okay, good. Yeah, and it does. Yeah, Cynthia, exactly. It does really help you not only understand the questions that you got wrong, but think about this question 3. Like, this is one that you get right, but you didn't really understand it. You were confused by it when you did it under time conditions. And you'd be surprised at how many of those questions that you end up getting right but didn't really understand are ones that are really valuable to review. And that's a big part of the value of this review process. You're catching other sources of confusion besides just the ones that you answered incorrectly. A lot of those that are in the gray area are really important to review because those are ones that you kind of understand, right? And by reviewing those, you'll be able to, in the future, when you see another question like it, answer them more quickly and more confidently and get them out of the way faster so you can spend more time on the other ones. All right, good. Okay, let's jump to some actual LSAT questions then with all this in mind. And one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about this review process and why it's so important is because when we go over these questions, we're going to look at a few different questions. And again, I said we're going to work on what we call strengthen and weaken questions. I'm going to give you a chance to try this question just on your own. I'm going to put a question up on the screen. I'm going to give you 1 minute and 20 to work on it, which is about average time to work on a logical reasoning question. When we're done, we're going to go through a pretty detailed process of reviewing this question. And what I'd like you to focus on is not just understanding this question, but think about the process that we're following to discuss the question. Because the process that we're going to follow in this free prep hour session to review these strengthen and weaken questions that we look at is the process. It's mirroring, basically I'm demonstrating and mirroring the process that you should be following when you review questions on your own. So again, don't just pay attention to what the correct answer is or whether you got it right or wrong, but pay attention to the steps that we follow when we go ahead and review. All right, so you'll see that in a minute. For now, what I'll do is show you a question, and I'd like you to go ahead, take 1 minute and 20 to work through the question. And if you think you have a correct answer, go ahead and put the answer in the chat window when you are ready. So here it is. All right, that was a minute and 20. Go ahead and put your answer in the chat window, whether or not you are sure it is correct. See, everybody put an answer in the chat window. And if you're not sure, I know a couple people came in a little bit after we started. If you're not sure where the chat window is, hover your mouse over the bottom of the screen. You should see a little chat button pop up and you can put your answer in the chat window that way. Okay, Mallory, I have a question for you. Would you like to get on the microphone and explain, give me a yes or no in the chat window, Mallory. Would you like to get on the microphone and explain how you answered this question? What were the steps that you followed to answer this question? You don't have to get on the mic if you don't want to, but I'm curious, would you like to do that? Just let me know in the chat window first. Okay, great. So you should, Mallory, oh, you see it. You found the unmute button. Awesome. How you doing tonight?
Good. How are you?
Awesome. Would you mind explaining for us the process, the steps that you followed to answer this question? Just take me through step by step, not just what the correct answer is, but what are the steps that you followed to get to that answer that you think is correct?
Yeah, I first quickly read over the quote to get an idea of what it's about, and then read the question to know what I was looking for, and then went back and fully read the quote, and then went through each option and decided if it was valid or not. And then C seemed the most valid to justify to me, but I still went through and read all the options, and then decided C was still the best answer.
Okay. So when you were looking at the options, we're looking at the answer choices, were you just looked at C and decided it was right, or were you looking for the one that was right? Just looking for a right answer?
I went through A to E in order.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yes or no.
What do you ask yourself when you're looking at the answer choices?
If it's related to the point that the curator was supposed to make, and if it would justify it. So, or if it's really relevant at all.
Okay. Okay. Cool. So I'm going to look at I'm going to give you one suggestion right off the top, and then I want to ask you a couple more things and dive into this a little deeper with you. One suggestion I'm going to make is, when you talk about reading the quote, or we call that the stimulus, the little paragraph up here, right? I would recommend that you always read the question first. Let's just get rid of this reading through the paragraph before you read the question. Why do you think that's a good idea? Why do you think I'm recommending that? Any idea?
To cut down on time so you know what you're looking for first.
Those two things are absolutely correct. Yeah, one, it cuts down on time, but two, these questions are going to ask you to do different things. And by reading it takes a little bit of effort to train yourself to do this, but by reading the question stem first, you actually know what you're looking for when you go ahead and read the stimulus, the paragraph here, and you can read with a sharper understanding, a more specific understanding that will help you answer the question and find the correct answer. So now what is this question asking us to do? It says, which of the following principles, if valid, most helps to justify the curator's reasoning? What does justify the reasoning mean to you?
Justify why they are making that point. Prove there's a reason that they should say that.
Well, what is the reasoning? When it says the reasoning, what do we mean by the reasoning?
That, why they believe, the way they got to the final answer that they should continue the restoration based on the facts they used to get to that conclusion.
Yeah, cool. You call the conclusion, absolutely, yeah. So this is the conclusion, the restoration should continue. So when we say reasoning, we're talking about an argument. You'll see these words used a lot in logical reasoning, and they're kind of interchangeable. When a question talks about reasoning, or an argument or a conclusion. All of these questions are asking you about arguments. Like 80% of all logical reasoning questions are asking you about an argument and testing your ability to understand arguments. So the foundation of an argument is the conclusion, the main point. We can say like an argument or reasoning exists to try to convince you that the conclusion is true. I'm going to ask you one more question, Mallory. And if you want to hop off, you can pass the buck, and I'll ask somebody else some questions if you want. But I'll just ask you one more. How do you know that? Well, I'm going to ask you a couple more questions. How do we know that this is the conclusion of the argument? Is there a way you could convince me of that?
So they propose a counter argument and then say, notwithstanding that, their conclusion, and then explain why.
Yeah, that's actually a really common structure on the LSAT in logical reasoning, which they give you some kind of like counterpoint. Somebody says something, right? You know, critics say something, and then they pivot around and say something different, right? The curator, whoever's making the argument, pivots around and says something different. Is there any other way that we know that this is the conclusion?
It's, I guess, just a statement that they seem to be believing in.
Okay. Is there anything else we have to consider besides that statement, besides that conclusion?
Their reasoning behind it. Why?
Yeah. The premise, right? The premise. So an argument on the LSAT, arguments on the LSAT consist of a premise and a conclusion. So the conclusion is the main point. The whole reason the argument exists is to try to convince you that the argument is, the whole reason the argument exists is to try to convince you that the conclusion is true. And then there's also going to be a premise or premises, and those exist to support the conclusion. Those are the reasons why whoever's making this argument wants you to believe the conclusion is true. What's the premise here?
That removing the grime will expose it to acids formed by water vapor and human breath effluents.
Okay. Now, does that convince us that the restoration should continue?
No,
that's the counterpoint.
Doing that would ruin it, but you can't see the frescoes in their present condition.
Yeah, so that's the support. That's what we're looking for. So what a premise does is provide support for the conclusion, right? So every argument that you see in LSAT logical reasoning will have a conclusion and at least one premise supporting it, at least one statement in here that is meant to try to convince us that the conclusion is true. And this is what logical reasoning is testing. It's testing your ability to understand, like, what is the conclusion and what is the support for that conclusion. That's what the reasoning is. The reasoning is the link between that premise and that conclusion. All right. So is this a convincing argument? Does that premise that the frescoes in their present condition cannot be seen as they appeared when painted by Michelangelo, does that convince us that the conclusion is true?
Not necessarily.
Okay. Why not? It sounds pretty good to me. Like, hey, we can't see them as they appeared when painted by Michelangelo, so of course we should continue the restoration.
You would have to assume that the best way to, or the only way, I guess, to view art is it the way it was painted by its creator. Yeah,
okay. So, Mallory, you're doing an excellent job. Thank you very much for all your help with this. I'm going to let you get off the mic, let you get off the hot seat. You did. So your understanding of this is really good. And notice what I was doing was just asking you to be a little more specific about certain things. I'm being really picky here. But that's my job as an LSAT instructor. And that's what your job should be when you're reviewing, right? So you may have had a general understanding of what this argument was all about, what the reasoning was all about. But when you go back and review, you want to be this picky. You want to understand exactly what every statement is. So first of all, you want to understand what we call the argument core. The premises and the conclusion are what we call the argument core. And any logical reasoning question that involves an argument will have those pieces. It's going to have premise and one or more premises and a conclusion. That's what we call the argument core. And you want to make sure you're crystal clear about what the argument core is. You want to really, when you're going back and reviewing especially, you want to be able to crystal clear identify the conclusion and then the supporting evidence. And then understand what everything else is. Like you correctly, Mallory, explained, like this first sentence is like the counterpoint. It's the argument actually ends up, the curator comes out and ends up disagreeing with that. Every single statement up here, not just every sentence, but every individual statement, is you want to understand what role it plays in the overall reasoning or argument. And then you want to have some idea, like forget about the answer choices for a second and see if you can have some idea of what's wrong with the argument. Because if it's in a logical reasoning question, it's asking you to help justify the reasoning, that means there's something wrong with the reasoning. If we have to justify the reasoning, there's something wrong with it. And try to get an idea for exactly what's wrong with the argument. See if you can find multiple problems with the argument. Like Mallory, you pointed out that we're saying, well, so in order to like fully appreciate the art, we have to be able to see it as it appeared. Like we can't appreciate it in its in its current condition. What are other reasons? Other reasons may be that, like the critics point out, we're gonna, expose them to acids and things that don't sound very good for the painting. Maybe that, the restoration might harm the painting in some other way, right? So there could be a lot of reasons why this isn't a convincing argument, and you want to be as aware as you can of that. All right. Cynthia, I'm going to ask you the same question. Would you like to get on the microphone and talk for a minute? Because I have some questions for you about this. If you don't want to, that's fine. Just give me a no. I don't want to talk in the chat window. But if you want to hop on the microphone, you should have an unmute button that allows you to talk. Okay. All right. No problem. Alia, do you want to hop on the microphone? Do you want to talk for a minute? No problem. I know some people are... Yeah, it doesn't even matter why, right? Some people are in a place where they can't talk. Some people just don't want to, so no pressure at all. Alia, same thing. Would you like to hop on the microphone if you want to? Yeah, great. You found the unmute button. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Okay. Yeah, I can hear you perfectly. So what do you think about all this so far? How are you feeling about everything we talked about so far?
Good.
Is this the way you're normally doing these questions?
Yes.
Okay, great. So what I'd like to do now is talk about the answer choices. Let's look at some of these answer choices. What do you think of answer choice A?
So I eliminated A because of in the last line, it's greatness. There's nothing about greatness in any part in the argument, so I eliminated it.
Okay.
And it's, and like pretty strong saying greatness alone.
Yeah, greatness alone. So like, I mean, you might know, isn't Michelangelo supposed to be some kind of great painter or something?
Yeah, but that's just not what we're talking about in this argument. And you want to focus on like what's here and not, I guess, what like real world assumptions, knowledge we have.
Yeah, when you're looking at answer choices, like when you're evaluating the argument and trying to think about what's wrong with it, it's okay to say, oh yeah, like, it's okay to come up with real world possible objections. Like, hey, maybe like the restoration will harm the artwork some other way. But when you're looking at answer choices, you do want to be very literal. You want to be very literal based just on the information that they give you. So yeah, greatness isn't really part of our premise, right? The premise isn't, we're saying the restoration should depend on the information they're giving us on the premise. The conclusion that the restoration should continue is based on what we're given in the premise, and the premise doesn't talk about greatness alone. What do you think about B, Alia?
When I did my first pass, I left B initially.
Okay, good. What do you mean your first pass? And tell me if I'm saying your name incorrectly too, by the way. I want to make sure I'm saying
Aaliyah.
Aaliyah, okay. What do you mean your first pass?
So whenever I do these questions, I work wrong to right. So I go through the first time and get rid of everything that like immediately jumps out to me as being wrong. And then usually I can cut down to just 2 answer choices and then compare them to each other in relation to the argument.
Awesome. I am really glad you said that, because that is exactly the process that you should use, right? We get in a habit from taking tests for years and years and years of reading the question, looking for the right answer. And that's the way a lot of people approach the LSAT. Much more effective to do like a 2-pass, view of the answers. Your first pass, you're just like, I'm really strict about this. When I do my first pass through the answer choices, the only question I'm asking is it wrong? That's the only thing I care about. If an answer choice is clearly wrong to me, I'm going to eliminate it, just like we did with A. If I'm not sure, I don't see anything clearly wrong with it, or I think maybe it might be right, I leave it, just like we did with B. So I'm glad you said that. Let's just leave B. What about answer choice C?
Yeah, I mean, C was what I ultimately chose, but I left it as well in my first pass. So I was down to B and C choosing.
Good. So it looks good. Let's keep going with this. What do you think about answer choice D?
D, I immediately got rid of because of spending large amounts of money.
Yeah, spending large amounts of money, do we really need to spend, like, nothing in the conclusion is about restoration. Nothing in the conclusion is about spending large amounts of money. We don't have to justify spending large amounts of money. We just need to justify doing the restoration. What else is wrong with D? There's something else wrong with D. What else is it?
Large numbers of people.
You said that with a question mark.
Yeah, I'm like checking the argument to see if there's anything about large numbers of people. Yeah, I mean, there's nothing about large numbers of people. That's
exactly
like another real world assumption.
Yeah, it's just like greatness, right? Our support isn't about greatness. And in this one, our support isn't about large numbers of people, so we can get rid of those. That doesn't help us. That doesn't help us in any way connect the premise to the conclusion. E, Echo, you're doing great with this, Aaliyah. So what's going on with answer choice E?
So I got rid of it. Talking about like the same artwork versus in the argument, just speaking about like whether or not it can be seen. Those are just 2 different statements.
Yeah, that's kind of extreme. Cannot be regarded as the same work of art, but that doesn't really tell us, about it's different from being seen as they appeared. They're kind of hoping that sounds enough like seen as they appeared to make you fall for that one. But there's a pretty big difference between saying, hey, this is, seen as exactly as it appeared to Michelangelo when he painted it, versus, oh, it's a totally different work of art. So that really doesn't help us. All right. Aaliyah, I'm going to ask you one more question. Mm-hmm. Do you have, so we're in this situation, which comes up a lot on questions, maybe not for you, but for a lot of people it does, where you're down to answer choice B and C. You have these 2 answers. How do you make your final decision between them? And I would go even a little further. Let's say both of these answers look like maybe one of these looked better to you than the other, but let's say they both looked really appealing to you. Like, just imagine that B actually looked pretty good to you. How would you make your final decision between B and C?
So I was choosing between B and C just after the first pass, but what I did to ultimately choose C was, and just choosing between 2 answer choices in general, is I just like slow down and read them in relation to what I understand the argument to be. So for B, again, like A, the aesthetic value piece or phrase, and then the only if led me to eliminate it. The aesthetic value like seems like it would be the same as maintaining present condition, but that's not what the argument's talking about. And then only if was really strong language, so I got rid of it.
Why is strong language bad?
I mean, depending on the question type, like there's only like certain question types that I guess I'm attracted, or like I'm looking for strong language, and principal questions don't usually like pop up as look for strong language in my head.
Okay. I would adjust that. Strong language is great for principal questions. Strong language is great for strengthened questions in general, but actually, so here's a little quick, are you familiar with conditional logic at all?
Yep.
Okay, so conditional logic is all over the LSAT.
Yep. So that's the opposite of.
Yeah, so only if we can say, like, so conditional logic, just to make sure everybody's on the same page, everybody else who's listening is on the same page. A conditional statement tells us about something that must be true under certain conditions. So like if I say, if I'm in New York City, then I'm in the USA. So this is a really strong statement, right? It means if I am in New York City, it must be true that I'm in the USA. In fact, we call this the necessary condition. This is something that has to happen when you're in New York City. So B and C are both conditional statements. Like one way to say this is, I am in New York City only if I'm in the USA, right? That's conditional, right? Only if actually means the same thing as then. It means whatever follows must be true. So this is saying, B is saying an artwork possesses aesthetic value. So I'm just going to put possess aesthetic value. If an artwork possesses aesthetic value, then people observe. So, and C is actually a conditional statement too. It begins, there's an if in there. If the purpose is to enable the art to appreciate it in original form. So if the purpose is to appreciate an original form, then it is acceptable to risk future damage. So both of these are actually really strong statements. They're like logically, functionally equivalent to saying, if I'm in New York City, then I'm in the USA. The problem is one of them, what we're looking for is a statement that connects what we know in our premise, seen as they appeared, to what we have in our conclusion. Restoration should continue. And why would we not continue the restoration? Oh, because it may damage the frescoes, right? So this is saying, well, if the purpose is to appreciate the original form, then it's okay to accept the damage. So that kind of negates the objection, which allows the conclusion to be possible. This is talking about possessing aesthetic value, which is not what our premise is about. This is talking about people observing it, which is not really what our conclusion is about. So this doesn't really, strong language is really fine in a principal question, but it needs to be strong language that connects the premise to the conclusion or connects the premise to something that would help us be more likely to accept the conclusion. What do you think about that, Aaliyah? Does that you see what I'm saying about strong language?
Yeah, that makes sense with the strong language.
Okay.
The main reason I went with C is because unlike B, it actually addressed the portion of the argument that I was talking about, I guess the consequences of restoration.
Mm-hmm.
So even, I mean, once you pointed out the conditional logic, I can see that B is the opposite. But even without having to do that, C is still, C still addresses the portion of the argument that we're worried about.
Yeah. Awesome. Okay. Couple things that you said that I want to repeat for everybody's benefit, because when you're in this situation, I mean, let's just talk, it's kind of interesting that you had these two answer choices that were somewhat appealing. And this is a huge time suck in logical reasoning. This is a huge time suck on the LSAT. When you're down to two answer choices, like people will get down to two answer choices that both look appealing and then spend a lot of time trying to decide between them. And you can save yourself a lot of time by doing first of all, the one thing that you said, which is hugely important: slow down. The LSAT is not always about going really fast. It's about knowing when you can go fast and when you need to slow down. People who get top scores in the 170s, don't go through the entire test at lightning speed. They're able to do a lot of things quickly through practice and study and repetition, but it's also about knowing when you have to slow down and think a little more carefully or read a little more carefully. So this is a good process. I want everybody to think about this and practice this when you're, and Aaliyah, if you want to hop off the mic, you're welcome to do that.
Yeah, how do I do that actually?
Oh yeah, like hover your mouse down at the bottom of the screen and you should see a mute button.
Yeah, normally I do, like during class, but it looks different.
It's not there? Okay, it's there, cool. All right, so when you're deciding between two appealing answers, and you know, again, this can take up a lot of time, so have a process. Make sure you know and practice an effective way of doing this. So first, you want to slow down a little bit, downshift a little bit, slow yourself down a little bit. And I like what you said about reading both answers. So slow down a little bit, read both answers a little more slowly. Like, so let's say we're choosing between B and C. Before you do that, though, I would recommend that you go back and review the argument. And it may be just quickly reading the premise and the conclusion, reminding yourself what those key words are: seen as they appeared, right? In their present condition, they cannot be seen as they appeared. So apparently allowing them to be seen as they appeared is important. That's the support that we're being given for the conclusion that the restoration should continue in spite of the risks. So just taking a moment to reread the premise and reread the conclusion can sometimes remind you of that really important detail that's going to help you make the decision between premise and conclusion. Help you make the decision between the two remaining answer choices. All right, so review the argument and then read both answers. That's the next step. Once you've reviewed the argument, then read both answers again and see if you notice a difference. See if one of those definitely pops out at you as the correct answer or one clearly pops out as incorrect. And if that doesn't work, if that doesn't get you to a correct answer, the one last thing that you might do is notice the biggest difference. So you might say, like, what is the biggest difference between answer choice B and C? Like, you know, Aaliyah, you were thinking only if, although that is just, like we said, it's actually just a conditional logic indicator, but you're noticing something that makes a big difference between B and C. The thing that actually makes the biggest difference is this is talking about possessing aesthetic value, whereas C doesn't. C talks about acceptable risk future damage. And C is more about enabling it to be appreciated versus this is about the people who observe and appreciate it. So if you notice the biggest difference, sometimes that will allow you to make the final decision between two answer choices. If you get to that point and you're still not comfortable picking one of the answers, then guess and move on. And this is as equally important as anything else in this process. You've got to be able to cut your losses on the LSAT, right? A lot of people are locked into this idea that you have to answer every single question, and you don't. If you've given a question a good shot and you're down to answer choice B and C, and you know you followed these steps and you're still not able to make that final decision, then you have to be willing to say, okay, I'm going to take my best guess and move on. If you don't do that, then that's how you end up running out of time at the end of the section. So all these steps are important, and this is one of the ones I emphasize the most because sometimes it's the hardest one for people to do. So we just covered a few things. We talked about, we looked at this question, you spent a couple minutes working on it, and then we spent a good amount of time picking it apart, talking about it in a lot of detail. And notice, what we did. We talked about the question stem itself. What is this question actually asking? Make sure you understand that. And then this is asking about reasoning. So what does that mean? I'm talking about an argument. What is the argument? It's a conclusion that the restoration should continue. And the part that we're interested in is mainly the conclusion and the support for that conclusion. Why should the restoration continue? And then, noticing that there's a gap in the argument. This premise doesn't fully support the conclusion. With those things in mind, then we're looking at the answer choices. And when you work through the answers, you're always looking for wrong answers first. Why are the answers wrong? What specifically makes the wrong answers wrong? And then if you're left with a couple of appealing answer choices, then slowing down a little bit, looking at those more carefully and making the final decision. The better you get at doing this, the more carefully you do this when you're reviewing, the better you get at being able to follow all these steps in real time when you're working at full speed on the LSAT. And you'll be surprised. You can get to the point where you're actually doing all these same steps, except you're doing them within 1 minute and 20 seconds, and you're able to answer questions that quickly. And while still following all these steps. That's part of the value of review. Not only by following a good, effective process during review are you thoroughly understanding a question, but you're also practicing an effective process that you can actually use in real time to answer questions. So does anyone have a question about any of that? Anything that we just talked about here? Again, we're getting real deep in the woods here, deep in the weeds and reviewing this question, working through this question and reviewing it, but it's valuable to do this. It's the kind of work that you want to do when you're reviewing. Okay. All right. Let's do another question real quick. I know we only have a few minutes left, but let's go ahead and do another question. Let's look at this one. Let's see. Let's do this one. What the heck? So same thing. I'm going to give you 1 minute and 20 to work on this question. And if you have an answer, go ahead and put the answer in the chat window. We'll give you 1 minute and 20 seconds. All right, that was 1 minute and 20 seconds. Let's go ahead and have everybody put an answer in the chat window. Even if you're not sure if your answer is correct or not, go ahead and put your answer in the chat window. And again, you may need to hover your mouse down around the bottom of the screen to find that chat window. Find the button that says chat. Okay. All right, so we got a split here, a couple different answers. So what I'm going to do is, again, quickly take us through that process that we just went through of analyzing the question. This review process that we were just talking about. So we're going to read the question first. Which one of the following principles, if valid, most helps to justify the judge's reasoning? So it's the same kind of question, right? We're trying to justify the reasoning, right? So we're going to go up here to the paragraph, and we're going to figure out what the reasoning is. What's the conclusion? The conclusion of the argument is his excuse is unacceptable. Okay, well, what is the excuse? So this is one of those interesting questions because it's referring back to an earlier part of the argument. It's referring back to something that was mentioned earlier. So we need to know what that excuse is. The excuse is unacceptable. The excuse is that he was confused as to whether local or national building codes applied in the area he was building. So that excuse, being confused as to whether national or local building codes applied, is unacceptable. The rest, and then then we need to figure out what is the premise, what is the support for that. Okay, if that excuse is unacceptable, what's the support? Following this word since, he is charged with non-compliance with national codes. Okay, so he is charged with non-compliance with national codes. Therefore, his excuse that he was confused as to whether national or local building codes applied is unacceptable. So it's an interesting argument, right? There seems to be a little more missing from this argument than there was with our previous ones. Now, we could go through the rest of this argument and all the different pieces and what they mean, but you definitely want to be able to determine exactly what the conclusion is and exactly what the premise is. This is the basic step to understanding one of these questions. The rest of this, the excuse might be acceptable if he had been charged with noncompliance with local codes. That might be a premise too. That's maybe a piece of information that we should be aware of and keep track of, that the excuse could be acceptable if he'd been charged with noncompliance with local codes. But he's not. He is charged with noncompliance with national codes. So somehow this difference between local codes and national codes and the fact that he's charged with noncompliance with national codes, that's the reason why his excuse about being confused is unacceptable. So we've got a crystal clear understanding of what the actual argument is. The rest of this, the defendant admits noncompliance. That's just kind of background information that's kind of setting things up, giving us some context for the argument. So now we're going to go through that process that we've talked about a moment ago. We're going to look at each answer choice and just ask ourselves, is it wrong? Local codes and national codes must not overlap with one another. And you know what I'm actually going to do? I'm going to narrow this down a little bit because we basically got two answers here. Just since we're running out of time, we're actually at the end of the session. So I just want to look at let's just look at the two answer choices that people selected here. Any behavior required by national codes is also required by local codes. That's one of the answers that people selected. And ignorance of the difference between two codes is not an adequate excuse for noncompliance. So let's say this is where we landed. Let's say we landed on answer choice C and answer choice D. We'd eliminated A, B, and E. We just figured out, no, those are wrong. So let's think about the process. We would go back. We're going to look at our argument again. Conclusion, the excuse that he was confused as whether national or local codes applied is unacceptable. We're slowing down a little bit here. We're reviewing the argument. Excuse might be acceptable. They could be charged with noncompliance with local codes, but he is charged with noncompliance with national codes, so his excuse is unacceptable. I'm reviewing the question. So now I'm going to look at each answer choice carefully. Any behavior required by national codes is also required by local codes. Does that help strengthen the argument? Well, if anything required by, he's saying he was confused as to whether national or local building codes applied. But he's charged with not complying with national codes. And everything that's required by national codes is also required by local codes. So, Well, if everything that he's charged with not complying with was also part of the local codes, then it really doesn't matter whether he was confused, because he should have followed them, right? He should have followed them. So now we get to answer choice D. Ignorance of the difference between two codes is not an adequate excuse for noncompliance. Now that sounds really good too, right? Ignorance of the difference is not an adequate excuse for noncompliance. So this is where we get to one little word on the LSAT that can be really important to recognize. And very often in a situation like this, it's going to make all the difference between selecting the right answer or the wrong answer. It's most. And they even say, they'll even tell you in the instructions that for some of these questions, there can be more than one right, there can be more than one appealing answer. There's only one right answer. There's only one correct answer. So, both of these could possibly help justify the reasoning, but only one of them is going to do more. One of them is going to do more than the other. One of them is going to do the most to justify. So can anybody, I'm curious, anybody who's left, Mallory or Aaliyah, since y'all were on the mic before, I'm going to put you guys back in the hot seat. Can either one of you explain why one of these does more than the other? Yeah, Aaliyah.
I chose D.
Mm-hmm.
I chose D because I was focused on the excuse being unacceptable portion, that big conclusion, and I thought that D addressed that, whereas C did not.
Okay. Tell me more about that. How is it that, so you're saying D directly talks about noncompliance?
Right. Directly talks about noncompliance and talks about, and would help us, understand why the excuse is unacceptable.
Okay. Okay. So Mallory, I'm curious. Mallory, you chose C. Do you want to hop on the mic, Mallory, and tell me why you liked answer choice C over answer choice D?
Yeah, so I chose C and I didn't choose D because it says this excuse might be acceptable, so then saying ignorance of the difference between the two codes is not an adequate excuse. And then C also sounded similar to the whole being in New York, you're in the US argument, where any behavior required by a national code would then be required by a local code because you're always in that nation.
Yeah, so if it's required by national, then it's required by local. So that means if he'd followed, so what's he being accused of? He's being accused of not complying with the national codes. So everything that's covered on the national codes is also covered under the local codes. So if, I was confused, so what is his excuse then? He's charged with not complying with the national codes, and he said, I was confused, I was following the local codes, right? Because if he didn't comply with the national codes and his excuse is that he was confused, that must mean that he was following the local codes. But yeah, everything covered in the national codes is covered in the local codes. So if you were following the local codes, you should have been covering the national codes as well, but you didn't. So this C directly addresses the fact that he didn't comply with the national codes. He didn't comply with the national codes, so his excuse is unacceptable. Whereas D, and D is a really good answer, ignorance of the difference between two codes is not an adequate excuse for noncompliance. But
Scott, oh wait.
Yeah, go ahead, Aaliyah. Yeah.
Oh wait, hold on. Maybe I was in the wrong section. Sorry, ignore me. Never mind.
No, what do you think? So Aaliyah, what are you thinking about this? What do you think about the difference between
you know what That makes sense. I just I was gonna ask. I had went and I just made a mistake. I was looking in the answer key, and funny enough, I was looking at 69. Practice test 69, and the answer to 16 is D. So I was really confused, but I realized I was in the wrong answer key.
Okay, I've done that too. I've done that too. So a couple things about answer choice C that make it really appealing. Mallory, I like what you were saying about this little piece of information, this premise. The excuse, they say the excuse might have been acceptable if he had been charged with noncompliance with local codes. And that actually does create a problem for D. Ignorance of the difference is not an adequate excuse for noncompliance, but so it by itself is not an adequate excuse. Notice this is more general. This is more general to just ignorance of the difference between two codes. But there's something specific that the argument is telling us about this particular situation, which is that, hey, his excuse might be acceptable if he was charged with noncompliance. I think, honestly, if this sentence hadn't been here, the excuse might be acceptable had he been charged with noncompliance with local codes. I think if that sentence wasn't there, then D would be a great answer. I don't think you would have seen answer choice D because it would have been too close to a right answer. But the fact that they literally say, hey, this excuse would be acceptable if he'd been charged with noncompliance of local codes, kind of eliminates the idea that this, even if it is true, applies to this specific situation. So even though this does talk about noncompliance in codes, answer choice C is more directly related to the situation we're talking about, the difference between national codes and local codes. And so, there are a couple of takeaways here that you might find useful because, Aaliyah, you were talking about before about language strength, and sometimes for some questions, language strength is important, right? Saying like there are certain question types like what we call sufficient assumption questions, where we really like strong language. And actually in principal questions, we like strong language too, like we just pointed out. Other questions like necessary assumption questions or weakened questions, we actually would steer away from answers with strong language. So that's one thing that is kind of good to be aware of, but only as a guessing strategy. Anytime anybody talks about that idea of language strength, the two things you have to remember. One is that you need to be sure about the different question types and whether actually strong language is okay or whether strong language is something you would shy away from. And then you only want to use that as your guessing strategy, as your last choice strategy. You're down to two answer choices. You've read them both carefully. You're still confused. You have to take a guess. Then I would go to language strength. I wouldn't use it as a first choice strategy because people very frequently get questions wrong because they pick the first answer that looks like it has strong language or weak language or whatever. So you need to be at a point where you've eliminated some answers and you have two answers left that to you both look equally appealing. That's where I might use language strength. Another thing that I would use in that situation that I think is actually even more beneficial is I would look at the answer choice that is most directly related to this argument. And so even if I was taking a guess, even if I had to take a guess between C and D, if I went by that, if I said, hey, which of these is more directly related to this argument, I would choose C because it's talking about the difference between national codes and local codes. And this is just talking about more generally the difference between two codes. So that's another thing you can add to your bag of tricks. If you're looking at a question, you've eliminated three answers, you're down to two, you're trying to choose which one is correct between two appealing answer choices. If you have to take a guess, go with the one that's more directly related to the argument, to the content of this argument, or more directly related to the conclusion. All right, cool. So we've covered a lot of ground here. Cameron, you said, would the fact that he is confused is different from being ignorant? I like that answer too. That's another thing that you have to notice on the LSAT is you have to be really literal about language and notice differences like that. I think that actually is maybe, he was confused as to whether national or local building codes applied. That's a little bit different from ignorance of the difference. I mean, I don't know, is it? I guess you could say, I think that's worth noticing, Cameron. I think that's maybe like a yellow flag against D. I don't think that by itself, that fine of a difference between being confused as to which one applied and ignorance of the difference, I don't think that fine line of a difference would actually be enough to eliminate D, but it's good to think about. It's definitely good to think about. So thanks for bringing that up, Cameron. All right. Okay, so we talked about quite a few things here. We talked about reviewing, generally how to review on the LSAT. We talked about specifically how to break apart these strengthen and weaken questions and the steps to follow when you're reviewing, right? Really understand what the question's asking and then break the argument down, really understand what is the conclusion and what's the support. When you're looking at the, and try to understand the gap, try to get a sense for what the gap is. When you're looking at the answers, really understand why the wrong answers are wrong. That becomes a really important part of your strategy and a really useful, critical part of your speed, understanding why wrong answers are wrong. And then think about the process that you're going to follow if you're left with two appealing answers. Have two answers left. They both look good. What am I going to do? How am I going to make that final decision? Having a really clear thought process for how you're going to make that decision can help you avoid spinning your wheels and spending more time than you really want to, kind of feeling paralyzed about making that final decision. And, sometimes it comes down to just have a really solid way of guessing and take the guess and move on. So I promised, I'm going to do a couple things here. I promised that I would put some links in the chat window for those of you who are here live. I'm going to put some links in the chat window to some free resources on our website. And again, if you are watching this on YouTube, you can find these links in the information on the video on YouTube. Let's see, we have a question in the Q&A window. I'll go ahead and take a look at that. With the fact that he's confused. Oh, Cameron, sorry. Yeah, you put your question in the Q&A. Yeah, thanks for putting that in the chat window too. So we've covered that already. All right, folks, thank you all for being here tonight. And thanks to everybody who's watching on YouTube. Again, check out some of our free resources, attend one of our session 1 classes for free, check out our courses. So that if you attend one of our free trial classes, it is actually session 1 of a real LSAT course. So hopefully you'll get some good information and some good tips from that, whether you decide to continue and take the whole course or not. Check out our free prep hours. We do these twice a month. You can come here and attend live, or you can watch them on our YouTube channel, watch previous ones on our YouTube channel. So that's really all I have for everybody tonight. Thanks again for showing up. Thanks for being here. And good luck with the rest of your studies. I hope it all goes well. And I hope you do great on the LSAT. Have a good night. And for